Winter came to Nettleford the way a creditor comes to a failing house, without haste and without mercy, certain of what it was owed. It settled first into the low fields by the river, where the last of the barley had rotted black in the autumn floods. And then it climbed the lanes toward the cottages, testing every door, counting every chimney that had gone cold. There were more of those cold chimneys now than there had been the winter before, and more still than the winter before that. The village had learned to measure its own decline, not in coins, for there were few of those, but in absences. Fewer loaves in the baker's window, fewer lands in the spring, fewer voices raised in the tavern at night, because a hungry man does not sing. He sleeps to forget that he is hungry. The snow did not fall so much as descend, deliberate and grey, and it laid itself over the thatched roofs like a hand laid over a mouth. In the smallest of the cottages at the far end of the lane, where the wind found every gap in the daubing and pressed itself in like an unwelcome relation, a young woman sat by a single candle and sewed. Her name was Ellen, and she had learned long ago that the trick of surviving a hard place was to make yourself very small and very useful, so that the world, when it went looking for something to take, would overlook you entirely. She wore grey. She almost always wore grey, a plain wool the colour of a dove's back and a winter sky, dyed once and washed so many times since that its dye had faded to the memory of a colour rather than the thing itself. It was not a beautiful garment. It had never been meant to be. But it was warm, and it was hers, and she had made every stitch of it with her own hands, and in a life that had taken from her nearly everything else, that counted for something. On the table beside the candle sat a thimble of dented silver, the only object of any value she owned, and it had been her mother's, and her mother's mother's before that, and Ellen wore it on her finger the way other women wore rings, as a promise and a burden, and a small, bright weight against the dark. Her fingers moved without her watching them. She was mending a shirt for the miller's boy, whose mother had died in the autumn fever, and whose father had no time and no gift for such things. And Ellen had taken the shirt without asking payment, because the boy was 7, and the shirt was his warmest, and because kindness, she believed, was the one currency that did not lose its value in a bad year. Outside, the wind counted the cottages again. Inside, the candle guttered and steadied. Ellen did not look up. She had trained herself not to look up, not to hope, not to expect the sound of hooves in the lane to mean anything but a rider passing through, on his way to somewhere warmer. She had been overlooked her whole life, first by a father who had wanted a son, then by a village that saw in her only a pair of clever hands, and finally by a world that had decided, without asking her, that a quiet woman in grey wool was a thing of no consequence. She had made her peace with this, or she had told herself she had, which is nearly the same thing and lasts almost as long. The fire in her small grate had burned down to a red memory of itself, and she fed it a single stick of wood, no more, because there were only 11 sticks left and a great deal of winter still to come. She pulled the grey wool closer around her shoulders. She threaded her needle by feel in the dimness, licking the thread and finding the eye without a wasted motion. And she thought, as she often thought in the long blue evenings, that the world was a machine for wearing things down, and that the only dignity left to a person was to refuse to be worn down loudly, to fray in silence, to hold the shape of oneself for as long as the thread would hold. She finished the miller boy's shirt near midnight and folded it with care, smoothing the collar flat, and she set it by the door to be carried up the lane in the morning. Then she banked the fire and blew out the candle, and lay down in her narrow bed in the dark. And she listened to Nettleford breathing around her, the whole starving, patient village of it. And she did not weep, because weeping changed nothing, and cost tears she could not spare. And because somewhere in the marrow of her, she had decided that she would meet whatever was coming, on her feet and in her right mind, with her mother's thimble on her finger and her grey wool about her shoulders, and that this, if nothing else, they could not take from her. She slept. The snow went on falling. And somewhere beyond the black shoulder of the hills, in a great cold house that had forgotten how to be warm, a candle was lit in a window that had been dark for 3 years. And a decision was made that would send a rider down into the valley before the week was out. But Ellen knew nothing of that yet. Ellen only slept and dreamed of bread, and did not know that her life had already begun, very quietly, to change. The rider came on the 4th day of the storm, when the lane had drifted so deep that the villagers had dug a path barely wide enough to walk single file, and the first anyone knew of him was the sound, so foreign to Nettleford that heads turned all down the lane, of a good horse well shod, striking the frozen ground with the confidence of an animal that had never once gone hungry. He was a young man in the dark green livery of a great house, and the crest on his breast was one that every soul in the valley knew, and few had ever seen up close. A raven with its wings half spread above a bare and thorny branch, the mark of the Duke of Ravenmore, whose lands they lived on, whose name they paid their rents to, and whose face not one person in Nettleford under the age of 30 had ever laid eyes upon. He reined in before the tavern and asked, in a voice pitched to Carrie, for the seamstress. The word passed down the lane faster than the man could have ridden it. The seamstress? They mean Elin. What can his grace want with Elin? And Elin, who had been carrying a basket of mending toward the miller's, stopped in the trodden snow with her breath clouding before her, and felt the whole village turn to look at her, and felt the old, cold instinct rise in her to make herself small, to be overlooked, to let the danger pass her by. But there was no passing this by. The rider found her with his eyes and did not look away. His Grace the Duke of Ravenmore, he said, requires a seamstress of skill at the hall for the season of midwinter. Your name was given. You are to present yourself at the gate within 3 days, and you are to bring your tools. He did not ask whether this was convenient. It did not occur to him that it might not be. In his world, a summons was a summons, and the only possible answer was yes, and so he did not wait for one. He touched his heel to the horse and turned it in the narrow lane, and was gone back up toward the hills before Ellen had found a single word to say. And she stood there among her neighbors, with the snow settling on her gray shoulders, and the basket of other people's mending heavy on her arm. And she understood that winter had, after all, found the door of her particular small life, and had knocked, and would not be refused. That night the tavern was fuller than it had been in a month, because a summons to the hall was the largest thing that had happened in the valley in a year. And everyone had an opinion, and everyone wished to give it to Ellen, whether she wished to hear it or not. The hall paid in silver, said the smith, who had shot a horse there once as a boy, and never forgotten it. The Duke had not left his lands in 3 years, said the widow Talbot. Not since the terrible thing. And here she lowered her voice. Not since he lost the both of them in the 1 week, the young Duchess and the child, and shut himself up like a man closing the lid of his own coffin. He was cold as the grave, said another. He was cruel, said a third, though when pressed, he could name no cruelty, only the long silence of a lord who had let his village slide toward ruin without seeming to notice or to care. And perhaps, Ellen thought, listening, that was its own kind of cruelty, the cruelty of a man so drowned in his own grief that he had forgotten there were others drowning within sight of his walls. She said little, she rarely did, but she listened, and she weighed what she heard the way she weighed cloth in her hands, testing it for the truth of its weave. And beneath all the fear and the rumor, she heard the one thing that mattered to her, which the smith had said, and no one had contradicted. The hall paid in silver. Silver could be bread. Bread could be the difference for a family down the lane between a child that saw the spring and a child that did not. And so when the talk had worn itself out and the fire in the tavern grate had burned low, Ellen walked home alone through the blue snow with her decision already made, not out of ambition, for she had none, and not out of any wish to see the inside of a great house, but for the plainest and oldest of reasons, that there was a wage to be had, and a village that was starving, and that she had a pair of clever hands and no one depending on her, and nothing to lose but a life she had already made very small. She packed her tools by candlelight, her scissors, her needles wrapped in oiled cloth, her spools of good thread hoarded against exactly such a chance as this. Her mother's silver thimble slipped last of all into the little bag and pressed once against her cheek before it went in, the way another woman might have kissed an icon before a journey. She did not pack much else, for she did not own much else. 2 shifts, her second best gray, a comb, a heel of bread. She looked at the small, cold room that had held the whole of her diminished life, and she felt neither sorrow at leaving it, nor any great hope in the leaving, only the steady, low resolve that had carried her this far and would, she trusted, carry her a little further. In the morning she gave the miller's boy his mended shirt and told his father where she had gone. And she asked the widow Talbot to look in on the oldest of the cottages where the ancient couple lived who could no longer fetch their own water. And she left the 11 sticks of firewood stacked by the widow's door, without saying whose they had been. Then she wrapped herself in her grey wool against the cold, and she took up her bag of tools, and she set her face toward the black hills and the great house that waited behind them. And she walked. She did not look back at Nettleford. She had learned that looking back was a luxury, and that a person with a long, cold road ahead of her could not afford to carry both her fears and her memories, and must choose. And Ellen chose, as she always chose, to keep walking. The road to Ravenmore Hall climbed all afternoon through country that grew wilder and lonelier with every mile, the tamed fields giving way to open moor, the moor to dark stands of leafless wood, until at last, as the short day failed and the light went the colour of old pewter, Ellen came out of the trees and saw the hall for the first time, and stopped, and stood very still. It was enormous. That was the first thing, the sheer graceless mass of it. A great house of black stone, built by men who had wanted to be feared more than they had wanted to be loved, its towers biting up into the dying light, its 100 windows staring down blank and dark across the frozen park. But it was the second thing that struck her deeper and held her longer, and that was how few of those 100 windows showed any light at all. 3. She counted them, standing there in the cold, with her breath smoking. 3 windows lit in all that vast dark stone, huddled together in one wing, like the last 3 coals in a dead fire. And all the rest of the house shut and shuttered and given over to the dark. And Ailinn understood, looking at it, that she was not walking toward the seat of a great and living family, but into the tomb of one, a house in mourning for itself, a house that had decided, like a grieving man, to let most of itself go cold rather than feel the size of what it had lost. The wind came across the park and found her. She pulled the gray wool close, and she shifted the bag of tools on her shoulder, and she went on, down the long drive between the bare and dripping trees, toward the 3 small lights and the great shut door. And she did not let herself be afraid, or she did not let the fear show, which after a certain number of years amounts to nearly the same thing. She rang the bell at the servants' entrance, because she knew her place and had never once mistaken it. And after a long, cold while, the door was opened by a woman of perhaps 60, with iron in her hair and iron in her spine, who looked Ailinn up and down in a single sweep, taking in the plain gray wool, the worn boots, the bag of tools, and the steady gray eyes that did not drop under the inspection, and who said at the end of it, in a voice as dry as a hearth long swept of ash, "So you are the seamstress they have brought to work miracles. I hope you have brought your own miracles with you, girl, for there are none left in this house. We used the last of them up a long time ago." And that was how Ailinn met Mistress Hale, who kept the hall, and had kept it for 40 years, and would, Ailinn came to understand, go on keeping it, out of sheer bloody-minded loyalty, long after there was any joy left in the keeping. And who was, beneath the vinegar of her tongue, the closest thing to a friend that Ailinn would find behind those black stone walls. Mistress Hale brought her in out of the cold, through stone corridors so chill that Ellen's breath still smoked indoors, past shut door after shut door. And as they walked, the old woman gave her the shape of the place in a low, running commentary that Ailinn understood was both instruction and warning. The east wing was closed. The west wing was closed. The great gallery was closed, and the ballroom under dust sheets. And the nursery, said Mistress Hale. And here her voice did something complicated, and did not finish the sentence. The nursery is not to be entered. Is that plain? His Grace keeps to the library and his rooms, and takes his meals alone, and does not wish to be spoken to unless he speaks first, and he will not speak first. So you may consider yourself spared. You are here because in 1 month's time his Grace is obliged, mind you, not willing, to open the hall for the midwinter gathering, as the Dukes of Ravenmore have done for 200 years, and he would sooner swallow glass than do it. But there are appearances a man in his position cannot escape, however much he might wish to, and the house is not fit to be seen, and there are hangings rotting and liveries in rags, and no one left with the skill to set it right. That is you. That is why you have been fetched. Do your work, keep your eyes down, do not go where you are not sent, and you and I shall get along well enough. She stopped before a small plain door near the kitchens and opened it, onto a small plain room, a bed, a table, a stool, a narrow window looking out on the frozen kitchen garden. A room for a servant, of no particular importance. And it was, Ailinn thought as she set down her bag, larger and warmer than the whole of her cottage in Nettleford, and she said so quietly, and something flickered across Mistress Hale's iron face, surprise perhaps, or the ghost of an old and unaccustomed feeling at hearing gratitude in a house that had forgotten the sound of it. "We shall see if you are so easily pleased in a month," the old woman said. But she said it more gently than she had said anything yet, and she left Ailinn a candle and a jug of water and the knowledge of where the kitchen was, and she went away down the cold corridor with her keys chiming at her belt, and Elin was alone in the great shut house with the wind walking on the roof above her. She did not unpack much. She set her mother's thimble on the little table where she could see it, because a strange room became less strange with one familiar thing in it. And she ate the heel of bread she had carried from home. And she lay down in the servant's bed that was better than her own bed had ever been. And she listened to the enormous silence of the hall, so different from the living, breathing silence of the village, a silence with a held quality to it, as though the whole house were a person, holding its breath and waiting, though for what she could not have said. She thought of the 3 lit windows she had counted from the drive. She thought of the nursery that was not to be entered. She thought of a man who took his meals alone in a house with 100 rooms and lived in 3 of them. And though she had not yet laid eyes on him, and though everything she had heard named him cold and cruel and best avoided, Elin felt, lying there in the dark, not fear of the Duke of Ravenmore, but something she had not expected to feel and could not quite name. Something that was almost, though she would have been ashamed to say it aloud, something almost like recognition. One small, enduring creature sensing another across the cold, one held breath answering another in the dark. She slept. And in the morning she began, in the only way she knew, which was with her hands, to mend the house. She began small, because she always began small, and because small was where the overlooked were permitted to begin. She did not announce a plan. She did not ask for one. On her first full day, Ellen walked the parts of the hall she was allowed to walk, the corridors and the 2 receiving rooms that would be needed for the gathering, and she looked at everything with the flat, assessing gaze of a woman reading cloth. And she saw at once that the trouble with the house was not that it was ruined, but that it had been abandoned, which is a different and more curable thing. The hangings were not beyond saving, only filthy and sagging on their rings. The good chairs were only dulled with dust, not broken. The great windows of the receiving room had been shuttered so long that no one seemed to remember they could be opened, and when Ellen, on the second day, folded back the inner shutters of just one of them and let the hard, clean winter light fall for the first time in years across the dust-gray floor, a housemaid passing in the corridor stopped dead and stared as though she had performed an act of witchcraft. "It is only light," Aylin said mildly, and went on with her work. But she saw the girl come back an hour later and stand a moment in the unshuttered brightness, turning her face up to it. And Aylin understood something then about the house that no one had told her, which was that its people were starving too, in their way, starved of light and warmth and the sense that anything they did could matter, and that a house, like a village, could be brought back not all at once, but stitch by stitch, small warmth by small warmth, if only someone were patient enough and stubborn enough to begin. So she began. She took down the filthy hangings in the receiving room and beat the years out of them in the frozen yard until her arms ached and the snow around her was gray with it. And she mended their torn hems and rehung them. And where a hanging was past saving, she did not throw up her hands, but cut it down and made of its better parts a covering for the worst of the worn chairs, so that nothing was wasted, because Aylin had never in her life had the luxury of waste. She mended the liveries that Mistress Hale brought her in a great despairing armful, and she did not merely patch them, but took them in and let them out to fit the men who would wear them, so that the footmen, when they tried them, stood a little straighter, because a man in a coat that fits stands differently from a man in a coat that hangs on him like a reproach. And as she worked, quietly, without seeming to try, she changed the temperature of the house. The maids began to bring their own small mending to her in the evenings, and she never refused them. And in exchange they brought her news and warmth, and the first laughter that had been heard below stairs in a long while. Mistress Hale, who missed nothing, watched all of this with her iron face giving nothing away. But Ellen noticed that the old woman began to find reasons to pass through whatever room she was working in, and began, gruffly, to bring her small comforts: a better candle, a cushion for the hard stool, a cup of something hot on the coldest afternoons, and once, without a word of explanation, a length of good blue thread that Ellen had run short of, laid on her table while she was at supper, as though it had appeared there by itself. We shall take a very short breath here, you and I, before the house wakes the rest of the way, for the story is only now beginning to turn toward the warmth. And if you would not want to miss the way it turns, this would be the moment to subscribe to the channel, so that the rest of these quiet stories can find their way to you. Now, where were we? The house was beginning to wake, and on the 9th day, in the grey hour before supper, Ailinn met the Duke of Ravenmore at last. And it happened in the way that the most important things so often happen, which is to say without any warning, and in the middle of something else. She had stayed late in the great cold gallery, which was not on her list of rooms, but which she had been unable to leave alone, for it was hung the length of it with portraits under dust sheets, and she had lifted a corner of one sheet out of nothing but a seamstress's curiosity about the painted fabrics. And she was standing there in the last of the light with the sheet in her hand, looking up at the portrait of a young woman with a kind, laughing face and a child in her arms, when a voice behind her, low and level and cold as the stone underfoot, said, "That room is not yours to enter." Ailinn turned. He stood in the doorway with the dark behind him, a tall, spare man of perhaps 35, dressed all in black. Black that was not for fashion, but had the look of a habit he had forgotten was a choice. And his face was the face of a man who had once been handsome, and had let the handsomeness go the way he had let the house go, into shadow and neglect, the bones of it still fine, beneath a weariness so deep it had become the whole of him. His eyes found the portrait behind her, the laughing woman and the child, and something crossed his face and was ruthlessly put away. And Ailinn, who had spent her life reading people the way she read cloth, saw in that single instant of crossing and putting away the entire truth of him, which was not that he was cold, but that he was frozen, which is a different thing. For cold is a nature, and frozen is a wound. And a wound, however old, is a thing that once was warm. She did not apologize elaborately. She had learned that the guilty apologize elaborately, and the honest apologize once. "Forgive me," she said. "I was told the room was closed. I should not have lifted the sheet." And she let the dust sheet fall gently back over the laughing woman and the child, covering them again. And she stood with her hands folded and her gray eyes level, and did not drop them. And she waited. He looked at her for a long moment. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. She counted them without meaning to. "It is you who has been changing my house," he said at last, and it was not quite a question. Ailinn inclined her head. "I am the seamstress, Your Grace. I was brought to make the house fit for the gathering." He said nothing to that. His eyes moved past her, around the shrouded gallery, and back to her plain gray figure, standing small and steady in the great cold room. And something moved at the corner of his mouth, some minute alteration that on another face would have meant nothing, but that on his she would come to understand meant a great deal. Not quite a smile, nowhere near a smile, only the almost of one. the ghost of a muscle remembering an old use. "This is an improvement," he said, "of the whole vast house, of all her days of labor. This is an improvement." And then he turned and was gone back into the dark of the corridor, and Elin stood alone in the gallery with her heart doing something unfamiliar in her chest. And she understood two things. The first was that the Duke of Ravenmore was not a cruel man, but a grieving one, and that the difference, which the village had never troubled to make, made all the difference in the world.
And the second was that in 3 words of the plainest praise a man could give, this is an improvement. She had been more truly seen than she had been in years of living. And that this, more than the silver, more than the warm room, more than anything, was the thing she had not known until this moment that she was starving for. She did not sleep well that night. She lay awake in the servant's bed and thought about the wound behind the frozen face, and about the laughing woman under the sheet, and about the nursery that was not to be entered. And she felt, rising in her against all her long training in smallness, a dangerous and unwelcome thing, which was the wish to help him. Not the house, but the man. To do for the frozen thing inside him what she had done for the frozen rooms. To fold back a shutter and let in some hard, clean light. She told herself it was not her place. She told herself she was a seamstress and he was a duke, and that the distance between them was not a thing that could be mended with good blue thread. She told herself all of this, and she believed none of it, because Elin had learned long ago that the heart is not a reasonable thing and cannot be argued out of its purposes, and can only, at best, be kept quiet and made to wait. So she waited, and the house went on waking around her. The thaw between them, when it came the way a real thaw comes, not in a single warm day, but in a slow accumulation of them, so gradual that no one could have named the moment when the ice began to give. It began with the library. Mistress Hale let it slip one evening that His Grace read late, and that the fire in the library was forever going out because the chimney had never been swept and drew badly. And Ellen, who could not sweep a chimney, but could sew a draught screen, made one, a tall folding screen of the sturdiest saved cloth, and had it carried up and set beside the library hearth without a word, the way the blue thread had once appeared on her table. She did not expect to be thanked. She was not thanked, not in words. But the next evening, Mistress Hale came to her with an expression Ellen could not read, and said that His Grace wished the seamstress to attend him in the library. And Ellen went, her heart doing its unfamiliar thing again, and found him in a great worn chair before a fire that for once was burning well, the new screen at his side, a book open on his knee that he was not reading. "Sit," he said, and gestured at the chair opposite. An ordinary word, sit, that no duke says to a seamstress. And Elin sat, on the very edge of the chair, her hands folded, and for a long while neither of them spoke, and the fire ticked, and the wind walked on the roof, and Elin understood that she was not there to be given a task, but for some other purpose that the man himself did not have the words for and perhaps did not fully know. It was he who broke the silence at last. "You lift the sheets off things," he said, not looking at her, looking at the fire. "You let the light into rooms that have been dark for years. You seem to think that everything can be mended." And Elin, who might have said something safe and servile, found that she could not, in that firelit quiet, be anything but honest. "Not everything, Your Grace," she said. "Some cloth is too far gone. And then the kind thing is not to keep patching it, but to cut it down and let its good parts serve some new purpose, so that nothing worth saving is lost, even if the whole cannot be saved. She had meant it of cloth. She saw him understand that she had also, without meaning to, meant it of something else. He was quiet a long moment. Then he told her. He did not weep, and he did not raise his voice, and he told it in the flat, exhausted way of a man handling something too heavy to lift twice. The young wife who had laughed and made the great house warm. The child that had come too early and cost too much. The week in which he had lost the both of them. The way the world had gone grey and stayed grey. The shutters he had closed one by one because he could not bear the light falling on the places where they had been. The village he had stopped riding down to because he could not bear to be looked at, could not bear the weight of being the lord of anything when he had failed at the one lordship that mattered, the keeping safe of the two people he had loved. I let it all go cold, he said. The house, the lands, the people. I told myself it was grief. But grief is a season, and this is something I did to myself, and to all of them, on purpose, because a cold house asks nothing of you, and I did not want to be asked. And Ellen, listening, did the thing she was best at in all the world, which was not to sew, but to see. And she did not fill the silence with comfort he had not asked for. And she did not tell him his grief was wrong, or too long, or that he ought to feel otherwise. She only said, when he had finished, very quietly, "The child in the nursery." What was the child's name? And he looked at her, startled, because in 3 years no one had dared to ask. Everyone had tiptoed around the nursery and the loss, as though the names themselves were made of glass. And here was a seamstress, in grey wool, asking him, plainly, to say aloud the thing he had frozen the whole house to avoid saying. And for a moment, she thought she had gone too far, presumed too much, and then something in his frozen face broke, not into a smile, but into its terrible opposite. And he said the child's name. And then the mother's, out loud, into the firelight, for the first time in 3 years. And the saying of them did not break him as he had feared, but did the other thing, the thing Ellen had known it would do. It let a little of the pressure out, the way lancing a wound lets out the poison so the healing can at last begin. He did not weep, but his hand shook on the arm of the chair, and Elin, forgetting every rule of her place, reached out and laid her own hand over it, her small, work-roughened hand with her mother's silver thimble still on the finger, over his. And neither of them moved, and the fire ticked, and somewhere in the great waking house a clock struck the hour. And they sat like that in the firelight, the frozen man and the woman in grey, and something that had been locked for 3 years turned very slightly toward the light. It was Mistress Hale, of course, who saw it before either of them would admit it, because Mistress Hale saw everything and had opinions about most of it. She cornered Elin in the linen room a few days later and said, without preamble, in her driest voice, "I have kept this house 40 years, girl, and I have not heard his grace say his lady's name aloud since the day we buried her. And now I hear he says it to a seamstress by the library fire." And Ellen, colouring, began to say that it was not what the old woman thought, and Mistress Hale cut her off with a wave of one iron hand. "I did not say what I thought," she said.
I have not lived to 60 by saying what I think. I will only say this, and then I will say no more about it. That man was warm once. I remember it. The whole valley remembers it, though they have decided to forget, because it is easier to hate a cold lord than to grieve for a warm one who froze. You have done in a month what I could not do in 3 years, which is put a little heat back into him. Do not. And here the old woman's voice lost its dryness for just a moment and became something rawer. Do not let anyone put it out again.
And then she was all vinegar once more, and told Ellen the linen was a disgrace and to see to it, and swept out, keys chiming. And Ellen stood among the sheets and understood that she had been given both a blessing and a warning, and did not yet know that she would need the warning within the week. For the house was waking now in earnest, and a waking house draws attention, and not all attention is kind. Word had gone out across the county, as such word does, that the Duke of Ravenmore was opening his hall at last after 3 years of mourning, and that the midwinter gathering would be held. And that meant that the county's ambitions, which had been circling the great lonely widower at a respectful distance, now saw their moment and moved in. And chief among these ambitions, arriving in a lacquered carriage 4 days before the gathering, with a mountain of trunks and a maid and an air of having decided something, was the Lady Verena. She was beautiful. That had to be said first, because it was the first thing she said about herself. In every gesture, every turn of her lovely head, every careful arrangement of her lovely person, in whatever light showed it best. She was beautiful, the way a blade is beautiful, for use, and she had come to Ravenmore with a single clear purpose, which was to become its duchess. And she had calculated, not without reason, that a man 3 years frozen in grief would be easy prey for warmth that arrived beautifully packaged and asked nothing but everything in return. She swept into the waking hall like weather, and she took its warming as her due, and its improvement as somehow already hers. And within an hour of her arrival she had noticed Elin. She noticed her the way a cat notices a mouse it has not yet decided whether to eat or merely to torment. "Who is this?" she said in the receiving room, not to Elin, but past her, to the air, examining Elin's grey wool with a slow smile that did not reach her eyes. "The seamstress, your grace," said a footman.
"The seamstress," said the Lady Verena, and let the word sit in the warm air, like a small dead thing. "How quaint." And she smiled her lovely blade of a smile, and moved on. And Ellen, standing very still with her hands folded, understood that a new season had come into the house, colder than the winter outside, and that this one had a face, and a name, and a purpose, and that the small, warm thing she and the frozen Duke had been so carefully, so silently, building between them by the library fire, was now in danger of a kind that no good blue thread could mend. The days before the gathering became a quiet war, though only one side knew it was being fought. The Lady Verena was too clever to strike at Ellen openly, for open cruelty to a servant would not have shown her to advantage before the Duke she meant to catch. She struck instead in the way of her kind, with the small, precise cruelties that leave no mark and can always be denied. The remark just loud enough to be heard, the task set at an impossible hour. The lovely, bewildered face turned to the Duke. "Whatever is the matter? I only asked the girl to fetch my shawl. I cannot think why she looks so stricken." She was, Aylin recognized, a master of her craft, as much a master as Aylin was of hers, and her craft was the making of herself large by the making of others small. And she practiced it on Aelin with a will, because some animal instinct in the Lady Verena had scented, on her very first hour in the house, exactly where the true danger to her ambition lay. And it was not in any rival heiress, but in a quiet woman in faded gray who had, somehow, impossibly, put warmth back into a frozen duke's eyes. Aelin bore it. She had borne worse from harder people for lower stakes. She kept her eyes down and her hands busy, and she did not give the Lady Verena the satisfaction of a single crack in her composure. And this, she saw, enraged the beautiful woman more than any defiance could have. For a cruelty that draws no cry begins to look, to any watching eye, merely like cruelty, unadorned and unprovoked. And there was a watching eye. The Duke saw more than either woman knew.
He had spent 3 years learning to watch a room without seeming to gauge a gathering from behind the shutter of his own grief. And though he said little and intervened in nothing, he saw the Lady Verena's small blade work, and he saw Aelin bear it without complaint. And he weighed the two of them. The beautiful woman who grew larger by making others small, and the plain one who made a whole cold house larger by her presence in it. And Aelin, glancing up once from her work, caught him watching, and saw in his frozen face not the almost smile now, but something harder and more purposeful, and did not know what it meant, and could not have guessed. The night before the gathering, he sent for her again to the library. She came expecting a task, some final instruction about the hangings or the liveries. He was standing when she entered, not sitting, and there was on the table beside him a great flat box of the kind that comes from the finest houses in the finest cities. And he opened it as she watched, and folded back the paper, and lifted out of it a gown. Aelin had made and mended cloth her whole life, and she had never seen anything like it. It was silk, the deep blue-green of a peacock's throat, sewn over with a fortune in seed pearls, cut by a master's hand. A gown fit for a duchess, fit for a queen. A gown that would have made any woman who wore it the most beautiful creature in any room in the land. He held it up in the firelight so that it shimmered and ran like water. "This is for you," he said. And he said it in the plain, flat way he said everything. But there was something underneath the flatness now, something almost like hope or fear or both. "You have given my house back to me, its light, its warmth. You have given me back things I did not think I would feel again. I do not have the words for it. I am not a man who has words. But I have this, and I want you to wear it tomorrow, at the gathering, not below stairs, but in the hall, at my side, so that everyone in this county who has spent 3 years pitying me and circling me and calling me cold, so that all of them can see, at last, the woman who thawed a frozen house. I want them to see you. I want you to be seen." And he held out the gown to her, the finest gown in the land, and it was the most that a man in his position could offer. And it hung there, shimmering between them in the firelight, and Aelin looked at it. She looked at it for a long moment, 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. And then she looked at him, at his frozen, hopeful face, and she did not take it. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was very quiet and very steady, the voice of a woman who has thought a thing all the way through before she says it. "That is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." And I believe you when you say it is offered kindly. And I am more moved by it than I have the words to tell you. For I, too, am not a person the world has given many words to. But I cannot wear it. and I will tell you why, and I ask you to hear me out before you are angry. While I have been in this warm house these many weeks, mending your hangings and eating at your table and sleeping in a bed better than any I have known, the village you are the lord of has been starving. Nettleford, your grace, in the valley below your hills, where I was born. The barley rotted in the autumn floods, and there was no harvest, and the winter has been long, and there are children in the lane where I lived who will not see the spring if this goes on. Not because anyone is cruel, but because everyone has been, forgive me, looking the other way. You offered me the finest gown in the land, and it is the finest gown in the land. But I cannot put pearls on my back while the people you are sworn to keep go without bread. So I will not ask you for the gown, your grace. I will ask you for the bread. Send bread to the village. Send grain. Send what you have let sit in your storehouses these 3 years while you grieved. Feed them. That is the only thing I want. That is the only thing I have ever wanted from this house, from the first day I walked up your drive in the cold. Not silk, bread. Give me that, and you may keep every pearl in the box, and I will count myself the richest woman in the county. And she fell silent, and stood there in her plain grey wool in the firelight, with the great shimmering gown hanging between them, and she waited to be dismissed, for she knew she had spoken far above her place, and she did not regret it, because some things are worth more than one's place, and the children of Nettleford were among them. The Duke of Ravenmore stood very still. He looked at her for a long time. 1 second, 2, 3, 4, and Aelin could not read his frozen face, and thought perhaps she had ruined everything. The small, warm thing, the whole of it, and had decided she did not care, that she would ruin it 100 times over for the sake of the bread. And then the Duke did something she had never seen him do, something Mistress Hale had not seen him do in 3 years, something the whole cold house had forgotten was possible. He lowered the gown, and he smiled. Not the almost, not the ghost of a muscle remembering an old use, a true smile, slow and astonished and warm, breaking across his frozen face like the first real thaw of spring breaking the ice on a river. And it changed him entirely. It made him young. It made him the man the whole valley had decided to forget. And he looked at the woman in grey, who had refused a queen's ransom in silk, and asked instead for bread for people she owed nothing to. And he said, in a voice that had gone rough, "I have been 3 years in the dark, and I let a whole village starve within sight of my walls. And it took a seamstress in grey wool to shame me into remembering that I am a lord, and that a lord is not a man who is served, but a man who serves. The bread goes out tomorrow, tonight, now, every storehouse I have. And Verena," and here his voice changed, hardened, cleared, as though a fog had lifted from it. "The Lady Verena and everyone else who comes to my hall tomorrow will learn, whether they wish to or not, exactly who it is that thawed this house." And he set the finest gown in the land aside on the table, as though it were of no importance at all, which, he had just discovered, it was. And he sent that very night for his steward and his cartman, and before the moon was down, the storehouses of Ravenmore were open for the first time in 3 years. And the carts went creaking down the black road into the valley, loaded with grain and bread and salted meat, toward the starving lane
where Ellen had been born. And the news ran ahead of them, cottage to cottage. "They are sending food. The hall is sending food at last." And doors that had been shut in despair opened one by one into the winter night. And the people of Nettleford stood in their lane in the cold and wept for gladness, and did not yet know the name of the woman in grey who had asked for bread instead of pearls, but would know it soon, and would not forget it.
And Ellen, back in the great house, lay awake in the servant's bed and listened to the carts going out into the dark, the creak and the jingle of the harness fading down toward the valley. And she pressed her mother's silver thimble against her cheek, and she did not weep, because weeping was still a luxury, and there was still a day to be got through, the hardest day, the day of the gathering, when the beautiful blade of a woman downstairs would learn what had happened in the night, and would understand at last exactly how much she had to fear, and would strike, Aylin knew, with everything she had. Let her strike, Aylin thought, in the dark, with the carts rolling out toward the bread. Let her strike. I have done the thing I came to do. And she found that she was not afraid. The gathering filled the great hall of Ravenmoor with light and music, and the whole ambitious county in its finest. And it was, everyone agreed, a marvel. The hall thrown open after 3 years, warm and gleaming, its hangings rich, its floors bright, its cold master transformed into a host who moved among his guests with a quiet ease no one had seen in him since his loss. What none of them knew, what made the Lady Verena's lovely face grow tighter and paler through the evening as the whispers reached her, was why. She had woken that morning to the news that the storehouses had been emptied in the night at the word of a seamstress, that the Duke had sent a fortune in grain to a village on the word of a woman in grey wool. And she had understood, with the swift, cold intelligence that was her one true gift, that she had already lost, and that a woman who is already lost has only one move remaining, which is to make sure that if she goes down, she does not go down alone. She chose her moment with a real and terrible skill, when the hall was fullest and the music had paused, and the attention of the whole county was loose and ready to be caught. She caught it. She raised her lovely voice, pitched to carry, warm with false and lilting concern, and she said, "Your Grace, forgive me, but I must speak, for I cannot stand silent while you are so deceived." And the hall went quiet, and every head turned, and the Lady Verena turned her beautiful, stricken face toward where Ellen stood in her plain grey by the wall. And she pointed one white finger, and she began, with the practiced poison of her kind, to destroy her. "This woman," she said, "this seamstress. You have all heard the pretty tale, the humble girl who asked for bread for the poor. How touching, how convenient. Let me tell you what I have learned of your humble seamstress, Your Grace. That she wormed her way into this house on a servant's summons, and has spent these weeks not mending your hangings, but working on you. A grieving man, a vulnerable man, playing on your loneliness, angling with all her low cunning for exactly what she has now got. The emptying of your storehouses at her word, your favour before this whole county, your bed next, no doubt, and your name, and your title. For what else could such a creature want? And what a fool, what a poor deceived fool she has made of you, of all of you, who weep over her bread, whilst she robs him blind." And she let it fall into the silence, the whole beautiful, practiced cruelty of it. And Aylin stood alone against the wall in her grey wool, with the eyes of the whole county upon her, and the old instinct rose in her to make herself small, to be overlooked, to let the blade pass through the space where she had been. And she did not move, and she did not defend herself,
because she had learned long ago that you cannot argue a person out of a lie they have decided to believe. And she waited, with her hands folded and her mother's thimble on her finger, to be believed or not believed, ruined or not ruined, as the room decided. But it was not the room that answered. It was the Duke.
He had gone very still during the Lady Verina's speech, and now he moved, unhurried, into the center of the hall. And he did not look at the beautiful woman who had spoken, but at the plain one who had not. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet. But it was the quiet of a hard, clean winter light falling into a room that had been dark too long. And it reached every corner of that great hall. "You wish to tell them who she is," he said to the Lady Verina, though he did not look at her. "Allow me." And he turned to face the county, all of it, the whole watching, ambitious crowd, and he said, "I was 3 years in the dark. You all knew it. You circled it. Some of you," and here he did not look at the Lady Verina, but everyone understood, "some of you saw in a grieving man an opportunity, and came to my house to see what you might take from it. And then this woman came. On a servant's summons, yes. In grey wool, yes. And she did not try to take one single thing from me. She lifted the sheets off my windows and let the light in. She mended my house and asked no thanks. She sat with me by my fire and let me say aloud, for the first time in 3 years, the names of the 2 people I lost. And she did not flinch from my grief or try to hurry me out of it. She only," and here his rough voice caught and steadied, "she only stayed. And when I offered her last night the finest gown in the land, pearls and silk, a duchess's gown, offered it to her freely to wear at my side before you all, do you know what she did? She refused it. She looked at the most beautiful thing I own, and she refused it. And she asked me instead, to send bread to a starving village that I, in my grief, had forgotten I was sworn to protect. She asked for nothing for herself, nothing. She asked only that I be the lord I had failed to be. That is the schemer you have been told to despise. That is the low, cunning creature after my name and my title. A woman who, offered pearls, asked for bread, and not for herself. For children she will likely never see again. In a village she left, to come and serve in mine. And he turned at last, and looked full at Ellen, across the shining hall. And his frozen face was frozen no longer. It was open and warm and unguarded before the whole staring county. And he said, and his voice was very low now, and only for her, though the whole hall heard it, "I chose her not for her beauty, though I have come to think there is no beauty in this room to touch her. I chose her not for her rank, for she has none, and wants none. I chose her not for anything she could give me, for she came to give me nothing, and asked for nothing in return. I chose her because in 3 years of darkness, she is the only soul who did not want something from me. And so, she is the only soul who ever truly saw me. She saw me. When I was frozen and cold and had made myself hateful so that no one would come near, she saw the man under the ice, and she did not turn away. And I will not stand in my own hall and let anyone, however beautiful, however well-born, call that low. It is the highest thing I have ever known." And the hall was utterly silent, and the Lady Verina stood alone in the center of it, with her lovely face gone white and stricken, not with false concern now, but with the real and final understanding that she had staked everything on a cruelty, and the cruelty had turned in her hand and cut her. That she had made herself, before the whole county she had meant to triumph over, small, and made the woman in grey large, and that there was no recovering from it. And she gathered the shreds of her dignity, and she left the hall, and the lacquered carriage was gone from Ravenmoor before the moon was down, and no one in the county ever spoke well of her again. For the county, whatever its faults, knew now which of the two women it had watched that night was the true one. And Ellen stood against the wall, with the whole warm hall turning toward her, not in scorn now, but in wonder. And the Duke crossed the shining floor to where she stood, and the county watched, and he stopped before her, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the counted seconds fell between them. 1, 2, 3, and then he held out his hand to her, not with a gown in it, not with any gift in it, only his open hand. And Ellen, the overlooked woman in faded grey who had spent her whole life being small so the world would pass her by, looked at the open hand, and did not make herself small, and put her own hand into it, her work-roughened hand with her mother's silver thimble on the finger, and let herself, at last, after a lifetime, be seen. Later, when the guests had gone and the great hall stood quiet and warm with the candles burning down, they walked together in the long gallery where they had first spoken, and he took the dust sheet off the portrait of the laughing woman and the child with his own hand, and left it uncovered, and stood before it a long moment. And Ellen stood beside him, and neither of them said anything, because some silences are fuller than any speech. Then he turned to her. "I do not know how to do this," he said. "I have been frozen a long time. I may not do it well. But I would ask you to stay, not as a seamstress, and not," and he almost smiled, "not because I have any more storehouses to empty. I would ask you to stay because a house that has learned to be warm again should not be let go cold, and because I have discovered that I cannot say the names of the people I lost, or the name of anything I have loved and buried, without wishing there were a new name I was permitted to say." And Ellen, who had refused the finest gown in the land, found that there was one thing in the whole of Ravenmoor she could not refuse. And it was this open, frozen, thawing man asking her, plainly, in his plain way, to stay. But she made him work for the last of it, because she had a little of Mistress Hale in her by now. "You have never once asked my name," she said. "You have called me the seamstress, and the woman in grey, and a great many kind things tonight before the whole county, but you have never once asked me my name." And he stopped, struck, because it was true, and something like shame and something like wonder crossed his warming face, and he said, "Then tell me." And she told him. "Ellen," she said. "My name is Ellen." And he said it back to her, Ellen, as though it were the first word in a new language he meant to spend his life learning. And then he told her his own given name, the name that only his dead wife had used, the name he had not heard spoken in 3 years, and gave it to her to use. And it was the most intimate thing that had passed between them, more than the hand in the hall, more than any of it. The exchange of names in the quiet gallery. And Ellen said his name back to him softly,
and at the sound of it in her voice, the last of the ice in him gave way entirely. And this time, when the warmth broke across his face, it was not the almost, and it was not even only the smile. It was everything. And Ellen, the woman who did not cry, who had not cried at hunger or cold or loneliness or scorn, who had held the tears back her whole hard life as a matter of dignity and thrift, found that she was weeping at last, and that these tears cost her nothing and took nothing from her, but were the other kind, the kind that come not from what is broken, but from what is, against all hope, made whole. And she let them fall, and he brushed them away with his thumb, gently, the great cold Lord of Ravenmore, made gentle. And outside the tall, unshuttered windows, the winter went on. But it was a different winter now, a winter with a spring inside it, waiting. 1 year later, the barley grew tall and green in the low fields by the river at Nettleford, and it was a good crop, the first in years, for the new mistress of Ravenmore had seen to it that the seed went out in the spring, and the tools were mended, and the roofs made sound, and the village that had been starving was starving no longer. And in the lane, where a quiet woman in grey had once fed her last firewood to a neighbour's grate, the chimneys smoked cheerfully, every one of them, and the children who might not have seen the spring had seen it, and had seen the summer after it, and were seeing now the turning of another autumn toward another winter that held, this time, no fear. Up at the great house, the shutters were open, all of them, all 100 windows of Ravenmore Hall, throwing back the low gold light of the year's end. And the east wing was open, and the west wing was open, and the great gallery hung bright with its portraits uncovered, the laughing woman and her child among them, not hidden now, but honored. And in the nursery that had once not been entered, a fire was laid, and the window looked out on a garden that Ellen had brought back from the dead with the same patience she had once brought to a torn hanging. And if that nursery waited quiet and ready for a purpose it did not yet have, it waited now in hope and not in grief. And that was everything. Mistress Hale still kept the house, and still spoke in vinegar, and still saw everything, and it wept exactly once at the wedding, and denied it fiercely ever after. And on a bright, cold afternoon at the turning of the year, the Duke of Ravenmore came looking for his wife, and found her, as he had found her the very first time, in the long gallery, in the winter light. And she was wearing, as she almost always wore, plain grey wool, the colour of a dove's back and a winter sky. For she had never taken to silk and pearls, and never would. And on her finger was her mother's dented silver thimble, which she wore still, every day, a plain and modest thing that had outlasted every gown in the land. And he came and stood beside her in the light, and did not take any sheet off anything, for there were no sheets left in that house. And he did not offer her any gown, for he had learned. And he only took her hand, the work-roughened hand with the silver thimble on it, and she leaned her grey shoulder against his, and they stood together in the warm and open house that they had thawed between them. The overlooked woman who had asked for bread instead of pearls, and the frozen man who had learned, because of her, how to be warm. And neither of them said anything, because they no longer needed to. And outside the tall, bright windows, the first snow of the new winter began to fall, gentle and unhurried, over a valley that had bread enough, and light enough, and love enough at last to meet it. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the end, and for staying with these two through the long cold of it into the warmth. Please tell us in the comments which city or village you are watching from, and what this story made you feel, for we love to know who is out there in the dark listening. And if you would like more quiet stories like this one, stories of the overlooked and the frozen, and the slow, warm thaw between them, please subscribe to the channel so that the next one can find its way to you, the way the bread found its way, at last, to Nettleford.